Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to completely dismantle the rigid textbook idea of grief and really explore the incredible, complex structures humanity has built to survive it. Honestly, if you've ever felt overwhelmed by loss or maybe felt like you just weren't doing it right, this breakdown is absolutely going to change how you view the entire healing process.
So, how long is this actually going to hurt? It is quite literally the very first question almost everyone asks when navigating a devastating loss. And it makes sense, right? It's human nature to want a strict timeline, a definitive endpoint to the pain. But to find the real answer, we have to completely rethink what grief actually is from the ground up.
Right off the bat, we have to recognize that grief isn't just about the end of life. It applies to literally any significant loss. We're talking about a major divorce, walking away from a toxic relationship, or getting a life-altering medical diagnosis. Dr. Peterson actually notes in his clinical work with domestic violence victims that unaddressed grief over losing a relationship, even a deeply destructive one, was often the exact vulnerability that trapped those individuals in a cycle of going back to their abusers. It's a massive emotional shockwave. Ultimately, grief is just the cost of connection.
To guide our journey today, we're tackling this in 5 parts. First, the nonlinear nature of grief. Second, the 5 stages revisited. Third, cultural scaffolding of loss. Fourth, healing through spirit-based research. And fifth, protective anchors and coping.
Let's jump straight into Section 1, the nonlinear nature of grief, where we're going to deconstruct the clinical model.
You know, for the longest time, the medical community viewed grief through a highly rigid, almost robotic lens. But as Dr. Peterson points out here, we desperately need to abandon that model. Grieving isn't some disease you cure. It's just a necessary, completely unavoidable journey to process what it means to live without a significant piece of your life.
Moving on to Section 2, we're going to re-examine the famous 5 stages of grief and talk about the messy reality of healing.
Okay, we've all heard of the 5 stages of grief, right? Well, here is the absolute most crucial thing to remember. People do not move through these stages in a clean, sequential, predictable order. It is definitely not a checklist where you finish one step and magically graduate to the next. The reality is way more chaotic.
Instead of steps on a staircase, think of these mechanisms more like a looping cycle. You start with denial, which is really just your mind's built-in defense mechanism against absolute shock. Then comes anger. And interestingly, clinical literature shows this hostility is very often unconsciously displaced onto safe targets, like snapping at a super supportive spouse, just because the griefer doesn't know where else to safely put their pain. Then we see bargaining, this totally futile negotiation fueled by just a profound yearning to change reality. When that inevitably fails, depression hits, a really heavy mix of hopelessness and helplessness. And finally, acceptance. But here's the kicker. You are going to bounce between denial, anger, bargaining, and depression over and over. They are repeating emotional states that basically have to be thoroughly exhausted before you can reach true, lasting inner peace.
All right, Section 3, cultural scaffolding of loss and how societies contain the chaos.
To help the human mind navigate these intensely chaotic, looping processes, societies build cultural scaffolding. Take a look at these statistics on American afterlife beliefs. 65% of Americans believe they'll be fully reunited with loved ones in heaven, and 60% believe the deceased get perfectly healthy bodies. What we're seeing here isn't just theology, it is a massive psychological safety net. It provides the profound cognitive relief of relational continuity. Basically, the hope that the story isn't actually over helps contain the acute panic of the loss.
Now compare that to Eastern traditions. While Western cultures lean heavy on relational anticipation, Taoist and Hindu traditions utilize highly proscribed, strict physical rituals. In traditional Chinese practices, statues of gods in the home are immediately covered in red paper to protect spiritual anchors. Plus, children might mourn a parent for 3 full years, a period called the Shosang, to directly repay the 3 years they were cradled as infants. In Hinduism, the anti-ST last rites require rapid cremation and really precise physical offerings to help the soul escape the cycle of rebirth. So, while the expressions differ drastically from Western anticipation to Eastern ritual protection, the ultimate purpose is absolutely identical, embedding the loss in a grand narrative to clarify social expectations and restore balance to a shattered ecosystem.
Let's step into Section 4, healing through spirit-based research, where we look at decolonizing trauma.
We can actually take these deeply ingrained concepts of ceremony and ritual and apply them to academic research and collective trauma.
Just take a look at this publication from the Journal of Indigenous Research. Scholar Anita Lukechi describes her time serving as the caretaker for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women database. The daily task of analyzing mass death and colonial violence caused her immense physical and mental trauma. We're talking night terrors, chronic pain, PTSD. She realized that the standard clinical academic approach was quite literally breaking her down. It led to a desperate need to shift from trauma-based extraction to spirit-based research.
And this decolonized framework is just fascinating. It treats the act of research itself as a ceremony. It embraces what scholar Diane Millian calls felt theory, which is the idea that doing work on colonial violence requires acknowledging our emotions, not just suppressing them like a traditional academic might. It asks the researcher, what am I trying to move, and where am I trying to move it to? By grounding the work in compassion, empathy, and prayer, the researcher actually uses spiritual anchors to safely move unhealed, lingering collective trauma toward a state of healing, all while protecting their own mind in the process.
And that brings us to our final section, protective anchors and coping, your benchmarks for survival.
So we've established that grieving rates vary wildly, right? Some people process in days, others in decades. But clinical literature does map out these general benchmarks to kind of help us navigate. At roughly 90 days, clinicians look for a baseline. If the acute, crushing symptoms haven't started to shift even a little bit by then, it's a sign to seek counseling. By 6 months, we typically want to see a noticeable improvement in raw symptomology. And if intense, debilitating rumination persists past 12 months, that's when it crosses the threshold into prolonged grief disorder. Now, these aren't deadlines. They are just reassuring guideposts to help distinguish a normative process from delayed or stuck grief that might require professional intervention.
So how do we prevent getting stuck? Well, to ensure healthy adaptation, empirical research highly recommends proactively utilizing specific anchors across 3 main domains. Psychologically, you have to map your triggers and use mindful distraction, basically temporarily redirecting a depressive spiral so you can process it later with a much clearer head. Socially, structured support groups and simply asking for professional help are your absolute strongest predictors of recovery. And spiritually, engaging in dedicated rituals or meaning-making gives your mind the scaffolding it needs so you aren't just white-knuckling through the pain.
Grief is a dynamic, completely unavoidable mechanism that will eventually touch all of us. So look at the tools around you and ask yourself right now, what cultural, clinical, or spiritual anchors are you building today so that you can survive the storm tomorrow?